part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. This is your host, Ben Billman, and I am so excited to bring you the first podcast of the offseason in college basketball. It is hard to believe that it's already been close to 2.5 weeks since Connecticut cut down the nets in Phoenix by beating the Purdue Boilermakers. So just a quick recap on that game, and then I will follow that up with a look at some of the top teams I expect to have going into the 24-25 season. And then finally, in the second half, I will do a deep dive and form my top 5 programs so far of the 21st century. So make sure to stay tuned to that in the second half. But first of all, a quick recap of the national championship game. To no surprise to anybody, at least maybe to everyone but Purdue fans, Connecticut rolled through most of that game. Now, I think Connecticut's game plan was fantastic. Their idea going into it was Zach Edey is going to get what he gets, but let's just make sure that no one else gets anything else. And so, yes, Zach Edey dominated. He looked like the two-time National Player of the Year, and I give him credit for taking what UConn was giving him and doing as much as he could to help Purdue win that basketball game. But unfortunately, 37 points was not enough for Purdue because the rest of the team only scored a total of 23 points overall. So yes, Zach Edey did what he did, but nobody else on Purdue was able to step up and fill the roles and fill the shoes that were needed to be national champions. But on the other hand, Donovan Clingan did a great job guarding on Zach Edey. The rest of the team played very well all around, and they really didn't have to go to the double team against Zach Edey. They were able to leave Clingan on him most of the game and just go man-to-man and not have to worry about doubling down. Tristan Newton had an amazing game. I expect him to be a great player at the next level, along with Stephon Castle, Cam Spencer, like I mentioned, Donovan Clingan. Outside of the starting lineup, though, for UConn, they didn't get a whole lot of help. Hassan Diarra did play 13 minutes. But outside of that, the starters were definitely dominant. And then again for Purdue, Zach Edey scored 37 and got 10 rebounds. But outside of that, Braden Smith was next with only 12 points on 4 for 12 shooting. And Purdue as a team was only 1 of 7 from three-point range. So that is just the end to the 23-24 season. Again, UConn repeats as national champions, and their 12 games over the past 2 years in the NCAA tournament have all been by double digits. Pretty incredible run. What has happened there since Hurley has taken over is pretty incredible. But now the question becomes, not just with Purdue and Connecticut, but with other teams that advanced far or maybe did not advance far, where are they heading into the 24-25 season? So first of all, we will start with the top 2 teams from last year in Connecticut and Purdue. Connecticut is going to lose a majority of their starting lineup, and the question now for Dan Hurley is, what is he going to do to rebuild that roster? Now, I have faith in him that he will be able to do it, but will they be at the national title contender level heading into next season? I can't make a guaranteed call on Connecticut, but I just cannot imagine that they're going to be at this level heading into next season. They're going to lose Tristan Newton. They're going to lose Cam Spencer. Donovan Clingan, Stephon Castle are gone. The only guy that I have no idea about at this point is Alex Caravan. They did have a couple backups that looked pretty good, but this team is really going to come down to who will they get late in the high school recruiting session and who will go there as transfers. And as of right now, those two questions have not been answered. I think Connecticut is going to take a step back, but with the system and the culture that Dan Hurley has built into that program, I think they could still be in the top 25 and near the top in the Big East. So Connecticut's fall off should not be too dramatic. And then looking at Purdue, maybe when I look across the landscape of college basketball as a whole, I think Purdue raises more questions for me than almost any other team. Zach Edey is gone. And for Purdue fans, that has to be a terrifying line to hear. Zach Edey, two-time National Player of the Year, 37 points in the national championship. He's gone. And now what do you do? If you're Purdue, you saw what they looked like in the tournament when Zach Edey took breaks, when he had to sit on the bench to get some rest. They just had nothing going. They looked scattered. They looked lost. What they need is for Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer to step up and play good basketball, good defense, lead that team, and they've got to improve their shooting, which has been an issue for them at times over the past 2 years. I still think Purdue is a top 25 team. I think they're going to compete for another Big Ten title, maybe not the favorite, but right up there. But this team has a lot of question marks about how is it going to create an advantage for itself without Zach Edey in the middle. That's going to be the question for Purdue. Okay, so looking at the other two teams that made the Final Four and what projections should be for them for next year. First of all, with NC State, they lose a lot of their roster. They're going to have a lot of turnover on that roster, and I think it's going to be difficult for them to match what they did this year in March and be successful next year. I think they'll be a middle-of-the-pack team in the ACC. And then Alabama, another team that is losing a tremendous amount of talent. Mark Sears being the most critical there. But if there's one thing we have seen with Alabama so far over the last 2 weeks is that they have figured out how to reload under Nate Oates. Nate Oates is getting players in the transfer portal, and I think Alabama will be one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the SEC next year, and more than likely will be in the top 10 most of the season. I think of the 4 teams that made the Final Four this past season, Alabama has the best chance of getting back there of all 4 of them. Okay, so that's the Final Four teams, but outside of those, what teams do I look at and say, as of right now, based on where we are, have a good chance to do what they did last year or even excel and do better than they did last year? Well, first of all, I think I have to start with Kansas. Kansas has had a fantastic offseason so far. They've brought in some really good transfers. Hunter Dickinson more than likely will be back, but even if he isn't, they still have a team that is going to compete and I think be the best team in the Big 12 and probably a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. So I think Kansas will be one of those teams that will enter next year at either number 1 or number 2. Houston, another Big 12 team. I think them and Kansas will be 1 and 2 in one of those orders, or vice versa, in next year's preseason rankings. Houston is bringing back almost everybody except for Jamal Shead. Again, that is going to be a big loss for Houston, but they're doing a good job under Kelvin Sampson of retooling that team, and you know that Houston is always going to play good defense overall. I guess I'll stay in the Big 12 with another team that I think is going to be spectacular next year, and that is Baylor. The Baylor Bears, probably the biggest move they've made this offseason is getting Jeremy Roach to transfer from Duke to Baylor. I think Baylor is going to have the best guard rotation in the country, and they're going to be very difficult to beat on the perimeter in the NCAA season and in the tournament next season. So far, those are the three teams, and all three of them in the Big 12. And then finally in the Big 12, I'll stick with the Big 12 with Iowa State. TJ Otzelberger has done a great job with that program. They were a 2 seed this past season, made it to the Sweet 16, and probably of any program at the top in the country is basically returning everybody of significance to that team. So when you consider that they were a top 8 program from this past year, based on their number 2 seed, I think they're going to stay right there or even improve. So it's crazy to think that between Kansas, Houston, Baylor, and Iowa State, 4 Big 12 teams that would not surprise me if all 4 are in the top 5 or top 10 next year to start the season. So if I had to make an early guess, I would say that the Big 12 is going to be the toughest conference in the nation, just like they were this past year. A couple other programs that I think are going to be just as good, if not better, than they were last year. And the first one outside of the Big 12 would be Gonzaga. Now, this one's kind of hard to believe because Gonzaga has made so many Sweet 16s in a row, and Mark Few has had this team at such a consistent level for so long. You would think it would be hard to improve, but I do think this upcoming year is going to be better than they were this past season. This past year, they were a 5 seed. They definitely did better in the second half of the season than they did in the first half of the season, and I think they are going to take that momentum from making the Sweet 16 to go even further in the NCAA tournament. We could see Gonzaga advance to their 3rd Final Four, and it would be awesome to see. I don't know if it will happen, but it would be awesome to see Mark Few and the Bulldogs win a national championship either this upcoming year or at some point as he is the head coach there at Gonzaga. Okay, as I mentioned, with Alabama being the top team of the Final Four teams that I think could advance back to the Final Four, I also think that they are going to be one of the top teams in the SEC. And outside of Alabama, in the SEC, I think there are 2 other teams to really keep an eye on, the first being Auburn. They got huge news early in this offseason with Johnny Broome, their big man, deciding to come back. I think he could be an early candidate for National Player of the Year. He is that good, that consistent, that important to that program. Bruce Pearl has to be sky high thinking about having Johnny Broome back on that team in the middle, ready to dominate. And then also the Florida Gators. Now, it's been a couple years since Florida has been at a very high level in the SEC or at the national level. But what they have coming back this year is going to be highly incredible. And probably the biggest move they have so far is picking up a transfer from Florida Atlantic in Elijah Martin. He was the star of FAU 2 years ago when they advanced to the Final Four and were a buzzer beater away from going to the national championship game. So now they have Elijah Martin, along with a handful of other transfers, which I think will put Florida at or near the top of the SEC, and it wouldn't surprise me to see them be in the top 10, top 15 heading into next year. There are a handful of other teams in the SEC. I think Tennessee, I think Texas A&M, a couple teams like that. And remember, Texas moving over to the SEC next year is going to add a little bit of a wrinkle. But I think Alabama, Auburn, and Florida at this point have to be considered the favorites in the SEC. Now, again, we already touched on some Big 12 teams, but now I do have to touch on Arizona. For those of you that have been paying attention to conference realignment, you know that Arizona is moving to the Big 12 next year. The question for me will be, will they be able to switch from the Pac-12, where they basically dominated for the last 3 or 4 years in the Pac-12, to the Big 12, where they may be a middle-of-the-pack team, even though they have about the same level of talent coming back next year. And that's going to be very interesting for Arizona. I have a question mark around that program to see how they do. I already mentioned Connecticut in the Big East, that I think they're going to be fine. I think Dan Hurley and his culture is going to be great. But if I had to pick a team outside of Connecticut in the Big East that I think is going to challenge Connecticut, it's got to be Marquette. Shaka Smart has gotten number 2 seeds there the last 2 years. They have a lot of talent coming back, and I think Marquette could be the team to beat in the Big East this upcoming year. And then finally, I think this might be a little bit biased, and it probably is, but many of you know that I am from the state of Indiana. I wasn't necessarily rooting for Purdue in the championship, but I was happy to see them be so successful. And that mainly stems from the fact that I'm a Hoosiers fan, and I've always been a Hoosiers fan. And so it was difficult for me to see Purdue do so well, but at the same time, I was really proud of them, and I loved the Big Ten, and it was great to see. Indiana had a down year last year, and I wasn't really sure if Mike Woodson was even going to be the head coach at the end of the year. Lots of question marks around that team, and I was pretty down on where they were and what they were doing. But as of right now, Indiana has to be the top team as far as success in the transfer portal at this point. So, Omar Ballo is a player from Arizona. People had him ranked in the top 2 or 3 in the transfer portal. Miles Rice and Kanan Carlisle from Washington State and Stanford, respectively, will both be huge transfers in as well. Also, Indiana has gotten a lot of players who have decided to come back from last year. So, even though I still have a lot of question marks, and I'm not quite sure if Mike Woodson is the right coach at Indiana, if I had to pick a team that I think outside of Purdue could win the Big Ten championship, at this point it would have to be IU. There are a lot of other teams that I could talk about, including Tennessee, Maryland, Cincinnati. I think Rutgers is going to be a very good team, and there are a handful of others as well. But as of right now, the teams that I mentioned are the teams that I would keep an eye on, and I've got to think that if I had to predict as of right now, the national champion is going to come out of the Big 12. There are just too many good teams, too much depth, too good of coaching, and I think that's going to be where we look for the national championship this upcoming season. All right, well, I'm going to take a quick break, and when I come back, we're going to take a look at the top programs of the 21st century.
Hi, everybody. It's John Tellage from the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast. Be sure to hop on with us to follow all the dramatic developments of the reigning American League Central Division champions. From game analysis to interviews to keeping tabs on who could be the next breakout star. We'll have that and much, much more right here. It's the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe here and join the fun.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Welcome back to the second half of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. So we are now in 2024. We have had 25 years since the turn of the century in the 21st century. We have had 24 tournaments. We have to remember that in 2020 there was not a tournament that was held because of COVID-19, and that tournament was canceled. So we've had 24 tournaments, lots of time for teams to cement themselves as the team of the century. A quarter century in, and we have a lot of contenders for that title. And obviously people are going to say right off the bat that Connecticut, with their 5th title in the last 25 years, not including their 1999 title because that happened in the 20th century, should be at the top. But what I have done today is put together a list of who I think are the top 5 programs of the 21st century. Now, again, not all of these programs have been consistently good every year, year in and year out, and we'll talk about more of that when I go individually through each one. But when we look as a whole, we step back from a broad view and see what these teams have done. They have been the most consistent and the most successful since 2020. So there were a few categories and a few exclusions that I had to put in place in order to narrow down the list, because looking since 2020, there have been dozens of really, really strong teams. There have been multiple teams that have won national titles that I didn't even consider just because they may have been good for a year, but that doesn't mean that they were good for the whole quarter century so far in the 21st century. So it did take a little bit of narrowing things down. So the first thing that I did to narrow down my group to get to 5 was that the teams on my list, even to be considered, had to have won at least one national championship. So right off the bat, that's going to eliminate a team that many might consider top 5 in Gonzaga. Gonzaga has been to 2 Final Fours. They've advanced to 2 national title games, but as of right now, they have yet to win a national championship. Now, Mark Few has done an incredible job, is on an incredible run of getting his team to the Sweet 16 year in and year out. But as of right now, I just cannot include them in my top 5 because they have not put a ring on their finger. They don't have that championship, and therefore they are excluded from this list. So that is the first requirement to be on this list. The second one is that in order to be considered for the top 5, you had to have advanced to at least 4 Final Fours. And this eliminates a lot of good teams as well. For instance, because of that, Louisville is eliminated from competition in the top 5 programs of the last 25 years, as well as Syracuse. Even though Syracuse has won a national championship, they have only been to 3. So therefore, they are excluded as well. Another team I forgot to mention that was excluded when I take away teams that have not won a national championship would be UCLA. UCLA made the Final Four in 06, 07, 08, and then also in 2021. So they do qualify based on the Final Four requirement, but they have not won a national championship in the 21st century, so they are excluded as well. The next requirement was that the team had to have advanced to at least 8 Sweet 16s during the 21st century as well. So that narrowed things down even more. And then the final requirement was for the amount of tournaments that the teams advanced to by just making the tournament, and they had to have made the tournament at least 15 times in the 24 opportunities of the last 25 years. There are 2 teams, and I will mention those now, Michigan State and Kansas, who have made the tournament every single year it has been held in the 21st century. So I do need to give a shout out to those 2 teams for accomplishing something that is very, very difficult to do, where you are making every single tournament and have no down years at all in the last 25 years. Okay, so after putting in all those requirements and all those barriers to entry, we now have 8 teams that I have that qualify statistically for this top 5 of the 21st century. But there are 3 teams that I believe fall just a little bit below the top 5, and so they are under consideration, and these are all teams that I could see rise up this list moving forward. It's not like they're terrible, but they do have some work to do to get into the top 5. First of all would be Villanova. Villanova under Jay Wright was fantastic. They won 2 national championships in 2016 and 2018, and they've been a number 1 seed multiple times outside of that as well. They have made 4 total Final Fours. The other ones came in 2009, early on in Jay Wright's career, and then in 2022, which was actually the last year Jay Wright coached before he retired. So 4 total Final Fours. They have also made 8 Sweet 16s in the last 25 years and a total of 16 NCAA tournament appearances. The one thing that Villanova did under Jay Wright was build slowly and build with experience. So there were a couple down years in there where he had to retool the team, bring in guys that were going to be there 3 to 4 years, and build the program back. And that's why there were some years that were lower than others. But when he had it rolling, when he did have that experience, when he did have those juniors and seniors, Villanova was near unstoppable. And that was apparent in those last couple of years in 16 and 18 and again in 22 when they made the Final Four and just had incredible runs there. Now, under Coach Neptune, the new coach at Villanova, they've got some work to do because he has not been as successful in his first 2 years as Coach Wright was in his last few years. So Villanova really needs to figure out who they are and what they want to become moving forward as we get closer to the 2030s. Will they be able to kind of get back on track to where they were when Jay Wright was the coach? So they are one of my first 3 teams under consideration, but definitely near the top when it comes to best programs in the 21st century. The next team under consideration is Florida. The Florida Gators, again, have been very similar to Villanova in the sense that when they have the experience, when they've been able to develop talent through their program, they're near unstoppable. And we saw that in the early 2000s and the mid-2000s when they made the Final Four in 2000 and then 06 and 07. They made the Final Four again in 2014 and have had tremendous runs all 4 of those years, and probably heading into the Final Four were the favorite heading into that Final Four in 2014 and unfortunately lost to a Connecticut team that went on to win the national championship. So the reason Florida is also under consideration is because up until Connecticut these last 2 years, Florida was the last team to repeat and win back-to-back national championships in 06 and 07. It was a really special team made up of future NBA players, Joakim Noah, Al Horford. Those were their main 2 guys, but also Corey Brewer would go on to have a nice NBA career as well. And, of course, Billy Donovan as the head coach. Now, since Donovan moved on to the NBA, Florida has fallen back a little bit, but they have stayed stable in the sense that they've never hit rock bottom. They just have not quite gotten to the same level they had under Billy Donovan. Now, I do expect them to have a very good team in this upcoming 24-25 season. When I do my season preview later in the fall, I will more than likely have Florida in my top 25 and have them as a team that has the potential to win a conference championship in the SEC. But overall, in the past 25 years, Florida has those 2 national championships. They've advanced to 4 Final Fours, 8 Sweet 16s, and they've made 18 appearances overall in the NCAA tournament. And then finally, my last team that was under consideration but did not quite crack into the top 5, and this one might be kind of a shocker, but it's Kentucky. Now, when people think about Kentucky, the first thing they're going to think about is John Calipari and the success that they had, especially early on with John Calipari. But people have to remember that before he got there, Kentucky was an average program before he got there, and in some years didn't even make the tournament and really struggled and had no Final Four appearances in the 21st century before John Calipari got there. So what they do have working for them, of course, is the 2012 National Championship. They have 4 total Final Fours under Calipari, but again, none that occurred before him at Kentucky. They have made 12 Sweet 16s and 21 total appearances in the NCAA tournament, and they would be my first team out. They would be 6th on my list of the best programs of the 21st century. Again, if they would have had a better era between 2000 and 2009 before Calipari came in, this would be a top 3 program in the country. But unfortunately, Tubby Smith had good teams, just could not get it done. Billy Gillespie came in, and that was just a disaster. Calipari righted the ship, and now it's going to be interesting now with Mark Pope taking over where that program goes moving forward. Okay, so those were 3 teams that were under consideration but didn't quite jump into my top 5. So let me start now with my top 5. At number 5 would be Michigan State. So Tom Izzo has been to the tournament every single year capable and possible in the 21st century if you take away the COVID-19 season when there was no tournament. You have to go all the way back to the first year of this century, 2000, when Tom Izzo won that national championship, which was required to be on this list in the first place. So he does have the one national championship, which is a qualifier, and he has also been to 7 Final Fours, which is tied for the most in college basketball since 2000. 7 Final Fours, but only 1 national championship. And outside of 2000, the only other year they actually even advanced to the championship was in 2009, and in that year they lost to North Carolina in what wasn't much of a game. North Carolina with Tyler Hansbrough basically handled that game from start to finish. But those 7 Final Fours are super impressive. 13 Sweet 16s, and again, 24 of 24 when it comes to tournament appearances. Tom Izzo has been consistent throughout. He hasn't had as much success in recent years. I think the transfer portal is maybe not the best thing that he enjoys. He's a coach who really likes to develop internally, get guys to buy into his system, and by the time they're juniors and seniors, they're starting to excel at a high level. But unfortunately, with the transfer portal, that is becoming harder and harder to do. But Michigan State at number 5 in the top programs of the 21st century. At number 4, I have the Kansas Jayhawks. Bill Self has been the coach there most of this century. Roy Williams for the first few years, and Roy Williams was successful in getting Kansas to the Final Four twice in 2002 and 2003 and making it to the championship game in 2003. But Kansas has won 2 national titles since Bill Self took over. First of all, they won the national championship in 2008 when Mario Chalmers hit late second half three-pointer to send it to overtime against Memphis, and then won in overtime. And then again in 2022, overcoming the biggest deficit in tournament history to be overcome and winning in 2022. So Kansas does have 2 national titles, both under Bill Self, but also with some success early under Roy Williams. Kansas has made 6 total Final Fours, 14 Sweet 16s, and 24 appearances, again, just like Michigan State, making it every single year that they were eligible. Now, one of the things that is holding Kansas back a little bit is some of the upsets that have occurred to them in the 21st century in the tournament. Probably the 2 that stand out the most to me, and I know there are more than just these 2, but in 2010, Kansas had by far the best team in college basketball this year, only to lose to Northern Iowa in the second round. And then again in 2011, I would say that Kansas again had the best team in college basketball, but they lost to VCU, an 11 seed in the Elite Eight. 2 losses that you take away those games, and I think Kansas probably goes on to make more Final Fours or maybe even wins another national championship or 2. Bill Self, for some reason, has had games like that in the tournament over his career at Kansas. But still, even with those losses, 2 national titles, 6 Final Fours, they are number 4 on my list of best programs of the 21st century in college basketball. Moving up to number 3, I have the North Carolina Tar Heels. So as just mentioned, Roy Williams was the coach at Kansas before heading back to his alma mater, and in just his second year at North Carolina, winning a national championship in 2005. He also led them to a championship in 2009 and again in 2017. So North Carolina has 3 national titles in the past 25 years. They've made a total of 7 Final Fours, which is tied for the most with Michigan State. And you might remember in 2016, it looked like that game against Villanova was going to go to overtime before Chris Jenkins hit the buzzer beater 3 to win the title. So North Carolina has 3 championships, but they've also had other opportunities, including in 2022 when they lost to Kansas after having the biggest lead that a team overcame in the national championship. North Carolina could definitely have had more than just 3. They have also made 13 Sweet 16s and 20 NCAA tournaments. They have been super consistent. They have been coached very well by Roy Williams, and then Hubert Davis stepping in here in the last couple years, and they have been a pretty solid, stable team since he got there 3 years ago, and I expect them to continue to be good and consistent for the foreseeable future. All right, now we are down to the top 2, and I think when we look at the top 2, these 2 are very interchangeable. I could go almost either way with either of them. But at number 2, I am going to put Connecticut. And I know a lot of people are probably going to say, how in the world can you have a team that has won 5 national titles since 2000 and is 5 for 5 in national title games since 2000? Also, the title in 1999 that doesn't count here, but is their 6th overall. How in the world can you do that? Well, when you look at Connecticut, they have definitely jumped on their opportunities. When they've had an opportunity to win a national championship, they have done that. But when you look outside of those years when they've had that opportunity, they have not necessarily met the expectations or been a team that people really felt threatened by or felt like was going to be a title contender. So yes, Connecticut has 5 national titles, 6 Final Fours, but when you look at outside of that, they only have 3 other seasons outside of those 6 Final Fours where they even advanced to the Sweet 16, and they only have 16 tournament appearances in the 24 possible seasons that have occurred in the 21st century. So yes, they have the most national championships. Yes, they are back-to-back defending national champions, but I have to downgrade them just a little bit because of those seasons when they just weren't good at all. Now, they did have a tough transition after the Big East fell apart. They had to go to the American Athletic Conference for a couple years before moving to the Big East. So much of it is maybe not their fault, but when you look through their last 25 years, you are going to see 7 or 8 seasons when you just scratch your head and think, how could a program as good as Connecticut be as average or as poor as they were? So I do have to hold that against them, even though they've won 5 titles since 2000. They finished second on my best programs of the 21st century. So now we're down to the number 1 program, and I think most people are going to be able to guess who this is. It is the Duke Blue Devils. Coach K, the most legendary coach outside of John Wooden in college basketball history, the all-time winner, most wins all-time in college basketball history. The Duke Blue Devils were as consistent as they could have been so far in the first quarter century, winning 3 national championships in 2001, 2010, and 2015, making the Final Four a total of 5 times, 17 Sweet 16s, which is the record for the most Sweet 16s on this list since 2000, and 23 total appearances in the NCAA tournament. So when you look at those numbers, 23 NCAA appearances, 17 Sweet 16s, there was almost a guarantee in these first 25 years of the century that you are going to see Duke in the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. And with 5 Final Fours overall, that puts them near the top as well. You could never count out Coach K when it came to the tournament. Number 1 seed multiple times. Now, they have been upset a handful of times, and real head scratchers that have happened, especially to Lehigh. That was one that really confused a lot of people and didn't make a lot of sense, as well as Mercer was another one that just did not make a whole lot of sense. But outside of a couple first-round upsets, they have been a program of consistency in the 21st century. Now, Coach K is gone. John Shire has taken over. Lots of questions there. They did make the Elite Eight this past year, but what do they have moving forward, and how are they going to compete? Will they be able to stay at the same level where they were under Coach K? So that is my top 5. Number 1, Duke. Number 2, Connecticut. Number 3, North Carolina. Number 4, Kansas. And number 5, Michigan State. It's been a great quarter century of basketball, lots of changes and lots of things to come as the game continues to evolve and college basketball continues to provide amazing tournaments and amazing moments moving forward. Well, thank you so much for listening. I will be back with you with more information about the offseason and what the big storylines are as we prepare for the 24-25 season. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.